Hey everybody, Phil Galfond here. In my opinion, one of the most crucial skills to acquire over your time playing poker is the ability to logically deduce the appropriate adjustment to a given player type or a given read that you have. I'm going to now show you several examples of how I would adjust to 7 different player types. From that, I hope that you not only gain how to adjust to those specific types of players if you encounter them, but that you digest the thought process that I use to come to those conclusions so that whatever type of player you face, whenever you see a strong tendency out of an opponent, you know how to make the right adjustment. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy these. Here they are. We've all found ourselves on the river after betting flop and turn with a busted draw, asking ourselves, why did we bet against this guy? He's never folding flop and turn. Today I want to talk to you about how we adjust to that type of opponent and when we do find ourselves on the river, what we do from there. Hey everybody, Phil here. Today we're going to talk about adjusting to a very loose opponent or sticky opponent. Now, I like to be specific when I define these types of opponents, and you should be too when you're making reads, because loose is a very general term. A loose opponent could be somebody who plays too many hands pre-flop, could be somebody who plays too many hands pre-flop and then calls the flop, but then starts folding the turn. Or it could be somebody who, plays reasonably pre-flop, plays reasonably on the flop, but then by the time they get to the river, never folds a pair. The way you adjust to each of those opponents is very different. Today, we're going to talk about adjusting to a player who is reasonable pre-flop, or kind of anything pre-flop, but specifically too loose on the flop and too loose on the turn. This opponent is, floating flop with just too much junk, anything that has kind of any hope. And then, it's not somebody who you're going to get to fold a pair on the turn, or get to fold like a reasonable draw with some showdown value, or actually like any kind of reasonable draw. Some aspects of adjusting to this opponent are kind of obvious. So let's start with those. We don't want to bluff flop nearly as much. Basically, this opponent is calling too much, so our bluffs are losing EV. It's that simple. And the same thing is true on the turn. So do we still want to start like semi-bluffs with pretty good hands? Yeah, probably. Unless this opponent is just literally never folding. Semi-bluffs, especially with like a reasonably high equity draw, they have the benefit of course, this opponent's sometimes going to whiff the flop and fold. And even when they don't, we've built a pot where we can hit a big hand on the turn or river and then put in a big bet. So I wouldn't shy away from betting your strong flush draws and your open enders and things like that, at least on the flop. Now, if you bet flop on like a, let's say, king 7 deuce with 2 hearts board, and you have queen jack of hearts, turns an offsuit 4, now I think checking turn makes sense. Some opponents are going to, have check called flop with a pocket pair or a 7 and then fold. But this opponent is somebody who's probably not going to fold those hands on the turn. So actually, all we're getting this opponent to fold, other than some random ace highs, is actually weaker flush draws that we would like to keep in. So yeah, start semi-bluffing on the flop with good semi-bluff hands. Skip the bad semi-bluff hands. And once you get to the turn, do some hand reading. On a board like 10-7 deuce with 2 hearts, well, now if this opponent's, let's say, check called a small bet, they might have a lot of just like king, queen of spades with the backdoor flush draw. So when the turn comes, the offsuit 4, now they actually have some things that can fold. Whereas on the other example I gave, king 7 deuce, they basically have ace high, a pair, or a flush draw. So do some hand reading. But generally, like you can widen your value range across all streets. I wouldn't go too crazy with this because what ends up happening, you basically just end up with, you end up building big pots sometimes with hands that you're uncomfortable with and not sure what to do by the time you get to the river. That said, this is a great opponent to make some 2-street value plays against. So let's say it's board is 10-9, 6, and it turns a 3, and there's a flush draw on the flop. Like basically any 10x can bet twice, and then you're gonna have to check a lot of rivers because it's gonna be an overcard, it's gonna bring a straight, it's gonna bring a flush, whatever the case may be. Or even if it doesn't, like it's starting to get too thin with 10-8s or whatever. 10-8. But definitely go for those 2 streets. You can go for 2 big streets sometimes too. Like jacks is a great hand to bet big on the turn, get called by every pair plus straight draw, etc. And then on a lot of rivers it starts to get too thin. Um, if this opponent plays kind of reasonably on the river, what's going to happen is they're going to get to the river with so many weak hands that they have to overfold the river. That's usually what you're going to see. Sometimes, of course, and again, know your opponent. Sometimes a player who's loose on the flop and on the turn is still just really stubborn and loose on the river too, even though they've gotten there with a weak range. But for now, I want to make the assumption that this player's loose on the flop and turn, kind of peeling with any hope of winning the hand, really wants to win the hand. But now, once they face a river bet, if they have a weak holding, they tend to fold. So the key here is when you get to the river with your potential bluffs, you have to follow it through. Now I want to talk about a mistake in logic that I see a lot of players make, even good players. And I've actually had conversations with players where they've said this to me, and I've said, actually, no, that's not how it works. So oftentimes, when players are up against people who they think are calling the turn a lot to then fold the river, they like to bluff turn. Because they're building a pot and then they get to bluff river and then that opponent folds, too often on the river. The problem is, let's say just hypothetically, we are potting turn and potting river to make the math a little bit easier. What people kind of intuitively feel like is, okay, well, if my opponent is folding to a pot bet over half the time on the river, then I just want to increase the pot because I'm going to win it more than half the time. That's not how the math works out, because let's say we get to the turn and the pot is $100. When we bet $100 on the turn, and then $300 into $300 on the river, we're actually risking $400 to win $200, because we're saying they're going to call the turn. Let's just say they call every time on the turn. Now we've put in 100, they've put in 100. That's how the pot gets to 300. And yes, on the river, you're betting 300 into 300. And if you win more than half the time, that's enough. But actually, the way that you got the pot to 300 is you kind of wasted $100 to contribute to that pot on the turn. So that the way the actual math works out is you're risking 400 to win 200 on the river if they're never folding the turn. So you need them to fold 67% of the time on the river or more. Now, in actuality, nobody's 100% call on the turn, so adjust the math accordingly. But don't get caught in the trap of thinking, okay, this guy, he's folding 58% of rivers, so let's just inflate the pot and bounce away, so I can just bluff him on the river. That just about does it, though. So too loose on flop or turn, the way that you're going to make your money is from value betting. You widen your value range a little bit, and you got to reduce your bluff frequency. So basically, even if you didn't widen your value range, your opponent's strategy just makes you money when you have good hands that we're already going to value bet. That's where all the money comes to you. And the way that you lose that money back to this opponent is if you bluff too much, or you bluff even as much as you were going to, because that's where they take the money from you. So the way to do it, even if you don't want to widen your value range too much, just take the money when you have the value bets, and don't waste the money when you have your bluffs. Good luck. Getting check raised is never fun unless you have the nuts. Today we're going to talk about how to combat somebody who's check raising too wide for value on the flop. Hey everybody, Phil here. Adjustments in poker are extremely important. It's where I believe I generate the majority of my EV. And adjustments sometimes are kind of obvious. For example, you're up against an opponent who's bluffing the river way too much. What do? Well, for starters, you call the river a lot with your bluff catchers. You're up against somebody who's never bluffing the river. Well, you fold the river. And there are actually things that you should do before the river against that opponent to further take advantage of it. But the basic and biggest exploit in those cases, they're kind of obvious. Oftentimes the exploits are not obvious. And so today I want to talk about an example of an opponent who check raises the flop too wide for value. So oftentimes, if somebody's playing against somebody who's check raising a lot for value, they feel like they're getting check raised a lot because that opponent's check raise frequency is higher. Now, it could be that they're check raising too wide for value and with the normal amount of bluffs, in which case their check raise frequency is going to be high. It could be that they check raise too wide for value and appropriately increase their bluffing frequency, so then their overall check raise frequency is far too high compared to what you're normally going to face. Or of course, it could be that they check raise a normal frequency overall, but it's just all value because they've gone too thinly for value and they haven't included the bluffs. For now, I want to talk about the player who check raises too thinly for value, check raises kind of the normal amount of bluffs. So what's going to happen there is a few things. Against the flop check raise, they're going to be under bluffing by a little bit because they haven't added the requisite bluffs. Also, when you bet the flop, you're going to get check raise more often, as we talked about, because they've got the right amount of bluffs or right amount of bluffs plus extra value hands, so their overall frequency goes up. A lot of people, when they encounter this kind of opponent, they hone in emotionally on getting check raised a lot, and they're like, okay, well, I need a plan for what I should do when I get check raised. So when I get check raised, okay, well, here on 10-7-3, let's say we're in a spot where our opponent's supposed to be check raising, ace 10 plus for value, but this opponent is check raising 10-9 for value. It can be very easy to get caught up in, okay, well, then I want to like bet 3-bet flop with queens, and I want to, pile in money with all sorts of hands, or I want to bet 3-bet semi-bluff the flop more because they have these 10-9 hands that are in a tough spot. And the reality is you're playing against an opponent who's under bluffing with their flop check raise. Yes, they have a few more of those thin value hands, but they still have all the strong value hands. And so playing that differently against the actual check raise does not generate that much EV for you. And actually, if anything, what you need to do is just fold more because they're under bluffing. And certainly, once it goes check raise and you call, and then you get to the river in one way or another, and they're betting through, fold more by the time you get there because their initial check raise range was too value heavy. There are some other things you want to do, though, that are less obvious. So one, which is going to be small amount of EV generation, is that you want to see bet a little bit less frequently on the flop because you're going to face raises. So what are the hands that we stop betting? Well, the hands that really don't want to be check raised. So with our, pure air bluffs, we don't really care about getting check raised too often. We can still bet those. With our strong value hands, we certainly want to bet those, and actually we want to bet those more often. So against this opponent, if you are slow playing some very strong hands at some frequency, you want to stop doing that. You want to just bet those on the flop. And then there are those kind of cuspy hands where it's like second pair or weak gut shot or like two overcard plus backdoor flush draw. Those are the hands you want to not bet as often because you're going to get check raised off of equity a little bit more frequently. The biggest adjustment to make is not on the flop. A lot of people, like I said, focus on, okay, well, this is what I'm adjusting to. He's check raising too frequently. So what do I do against a check raise? That's not where you generate the most EV. The most EV comes from what you do on the turn. So now if our opponent check calls the flop, what have we learned about his range? Well, we knew that his check raise range includes too many value hands. He's gone too thinly for value. Where did those thin value hands come from? They came from what was supposed to be his check call range. So now his check call range is weakened. He doesn't have as many 10-9s, queen 10s, jack 10s. So now we get, and oftentimes this type of player is also fast playing too frequently with sets. I mean, you're supposed to check raise a lot of sets, but just like always fast playing. So the way to take advantage of this opponent and generate the most EV is actually on the turn with turn continuation bets. Their check call range is weakened, and you can attack that by both widening your turn value betting range and increasing your turn bluff frequency. Now, if you have a read that they end up overcalling turn, or like call with some hands that are too weak, so they're calling the right frequency roughly, then you probably want to increase both kind of proportionally. But if you are up against somebody who, folds the correct hands on the turn, which means they're overfolding because they don't have as many of those good hands in their range, then you want to mostly add bluffs. Now, if you're not sure how they play on the turn and river, the safest thing to do is just increase both. So like widen your value range. So maybe perhaps before then on a brick turn, you might have had like some one street bets with whatever, queen 10 to check back turn and then value bet river. Bet those on the turn. So widen your value range on the turn and then increase your bluffs so that you're still bluffing at kind of an appropriate ratio compared to your value bets. It's so easy to, I guess I'm repeating myself at this point. It's so easy to get so focused on combating the check raise, but all the EV against this opponent comes from finding the turn C bets. Hey everybody, Phil here. Everybody wants to know how to adjust to a maniac, and The answer is it depends. There are different types of maniacs. And yes, at the very beginning of playing with somebody, you might be able to tell from observing a few hands that they're just putting a lot of money into pots, but you don't have more specifics at that point. And we'll talk about that. But what I want to do today is give three kind of more concrete, specific examples of a type of maniac. And I've come up with ones that I think are, like that I've seen before that are kind of reasonable um, characters. And then I'll talk about how I would adjust. So first, I'll start with somebody who, he likes to put in a lot of money on each street. He does this by over bluffing. He also does this by just kind of ramming in too much money with pretty good hands. Doesn't overfold, certainly, underfolds, but is not, he's not clueless. He's not check calling flop with no pair, no draw, no hope. But when he's got a little bit of equity or he senses weakness or whatever the case may be, he pounces. He's doing so with huge bets, huge raises. The first and most important thing to keep in mind against this kind of player is when they check to you, if you bet, you are opening the door for them to put in a huge check raise. So what's the most obvious adjustment that we make? Well, we bet with a range that is more polarized because a polarized range likes being raised. If we start going thinly for value, that's a range that does not like being raised. So on the flop, we're going to bet our sets. We're going to bet our top two pair, depending on we're going to bet our straights. We're going to bet our flushes, etc. We're going to bet our very strong hands. And then we're going to bet some bluffs. Now, this opponent is probably not going to overfold, like I said. So we don't want to bluff too much, but you bluff occasionally, obviously. This opponent is not clueless. If they see you just always betting, like always having the nuts when you bet, they're going to catch on. They're going to stop shoveling in 200 big blinds against you. So we need to bluff a little bit. Now, once we check back and we get to the turn, kind of similar logic. Basically, we don't want to open the door for this player to check bomb to whatever 6x pot. So once again, we're betting a pretty polarized range. And what this ends up meaning is that, first of all, we're checking back some decently strong hands that we would normally not check back twice to keep the pot small and go for value on the river. It also means that we're missing some bluffs that have reasonably high equity because we don't want to get blown off that equity, or we don't want to be forced to put in a ton of money with like the wrong amount of equity. But that's okay. I think oftentimes people don't like this approach, or they feel like they're playing too weak by, I'm not making enough money with my top pair weak kicker. I'm not making enough money with second pair. I'm not making enough money with a weak over pair. That's not how you beat this player. I mean, it can be, and obviously, if we want to get more specific into how they play, maybe it is. Maybe you start delay c-betting turn with some of these hands that, you get put in a tough spot when they check raise, but they're only check raising 10% of the time. It's not 30% of the time, whatever the case may be. It depends how kind of crazy they are. But this player is going to lose money to you. The types of mistakes they're making, they're going to lose money to you when you have a good hand, and they're putting in way too much money, both with bluffs and with value hands. So you don't have to do anything. The way that you exploit them is actually just relaxing. You don't have to like outmaneuver them. Like, yeah, they check raise flop, and maybe they've got too many thin value hands and too many bluffs, and now you want to attack that range. And sure, you can do some of that, but the way to really beat them is not get into that spot in the first place. So yeah, against this player, polarized flop c-betting range, polarized turn betting range. We're just only betting with hands that don't mind getting raised for the most part, and take it from there. Obviously, you'll get to the river with some hands like you'll get a lot of check bets. You'll have some strong value hands that can check bet, and yeah, if they check raise the river, you deal with it. But you haven't let them use maximum leverage against that portion of your range. When they're using maximum leverage by check bombing flop or turn, you've got a strong hand, and that's where you're going to make your money. So let's talk about Maniac number two. Maniac number two forces in way too much money with good hands, with weak top pair, and like sometimes like open ender plus flush draw, sure, but they're not bluffing that much. They just, they call your 3-bet with nines, and you're 200 big blinds deep, and the flop is 8-7-3 two-tone, and you c-bet half pot, and they like 5x raise with nines to get in 200 big blinds. That's this kind of player. They're just putting in a ton of money with pretty good hands and better. The easiest and most obvious adjustment to this player is once they put in a lot of money, fold unless you have a hand that beats a good portion of their value range. This player is going to, once again, lose money to you. Like when you have a very good hand and they have a pretty good hand, they're going to just give you all the money. They're going to make it easy on you. When you have a marginal hand and they have a pretty good hand, they're also going to make it easy on you because they're going to force in all the money. And now it's your job to just fold middle pair. It's your job to fold these hands that are just pure bluff catchers against a range that's not bluffing enough. Not only not bluffing enough, but then having way too many value bets, which means proportionally they're almost never bluffing. They make it pretty easy. And actually, against this type of opponent, you can do some bet folding with value hands. Now, it's kind of tricky because you don't want to get into a spot where they check jam turn for 5x pot and you have a hand that beats like, 5% or 10% of their value range, because you still have to fold that because 90% of the time you're losing. But it is unfortunate that you kind of like get bluffed off the best hand by a value hand. So be a little careful with those hands. But actually, you can kind of do some more like thin value / protection betting on the turn with like second pair that just has a very clear fold to the raise because they're not bluffing enough. And now another thing to keep in mind is when this player check calls on the flop and or turn, remember that they are kind of ramming money in with thin value. So when they call, they don't have that thin value that they're supposed to have in their calling range. So now their range is weakened. And you can bluff a decent amount. Actually, probably this type of opponent's going to overfold turns and overfold rivers because they're putting in so much money early with good hands. So yeah, this opponent, you don't have to take the same approach as Maniac number 1. It's actually a much different approach, even though both of them at the very beginning might present like players that are playing kind of the same way. So let's talk about Maniac number 3. Maniac number 3 loves to bluff. If you give this player rope, they're just going for it. Anytime they kind of get to the river with a hopeless hand and a big pot, if you give them a chance to bluff, they will. They love to, raise flop with weak semi-bluffs, strong semi-bluffs. They like to raise turn with weak semi-bluffs, strong semi-bluffs. They like to bluff the river when checked too. They like to bluff the river against small bets too, as well. This type of player usually doesn't like bluff raise river against big bets. They kind of they like to attack weakness, or they'll find themselves on the river with air because they bet twice, or like they see bet flop, you check call, turn goes check check, and now something hits on the river and they can't help themselves. Or they check called flop and turn goes check check, and now they can't help. Whatever the case may be. Oftentimes, like they'll bluff raise flop. So the flop is 10-8-3. They're in position. You bet. They raise with like every gut shot. Then you call, and then the turn is a king, and it goes check check. Well, now they've started a bluff, but they've kind of given up on the turn because they don't like the turn. But now that they are checked to again on the river and they can't win by checking, they like to bet. So that's kind of the most obvious adjustment, is make sure that in a spot where it's very likely that they have air, give them rope. Let them bluff you. Kind of similar to Maniac number 1, and a little bit the case with Maniac number 2. We never want to slow play. We want to bet kind of polarized. We want to bet all of our strong hands. And we want to be a little bit careful with hands that have to that are in an uncomfortable spot against a check raise, basically. So like decent semi-bluff hands that really don't want to bet fold their equity. Even on like that 10-8-3 flop, a hand like King Queen, King Jack with a backdoor flush draw and all those backdoor straight draws, like you don't want to get check raised off of that by their 6-7 and all that stuff. So check more of those hands that have some hope and like some good turn cards. You can still bluff on the flop, of course. And this player, it starts to get. So what you're supposed to do is you actually still bet the right number of value hands, potentially even a little thinner, maybe not. And then when they check raise, you just grit your teeth and you call down, or you get the money in. A lot of people don't have the stomach for that, and so you actually can probably get 80%, 90% of the EV against this player by skipping those plays, just checking the flop when you're pretty uncomfortable to face a check raise and call down. You're going to make more money if you're right about this read by betting flop and calling down, but you're not making a ton of money. They have better hands, they have draws that have reasonable equity against you. So yes, you're supposed to be betting and calling down because they're over bluffing, over semi bluffing, and barreling through often. But if you skip some of those plays, you're not going to lose that much EV as long as you're betting the quite strong hands. That's where they're just going to punt off the money to you. This type of player actually, when they check call, they more often have a made hand than a draw. I mean, it depends how loose they are. Sometimes they just call with, like high card and backdoor draws because they're super loose. Or other times they check raise so many of their draws, and when they check call, they have middle pair or top pair. So hand read accordingly. And, against this player, let's just use the same 10-8-3 board. You see bet flop, they call, turn pairs the 8. Against some opponents, bluffing, whatever, 7-6 works out well because they have to check fold their queen jacks and their flush draws and things like that. Against this player, that they probably raised a lot of those hands on the flop. So now actually they hit the 8 pretty hard, and they have like 10s and 8s pretty often as well. So those semi bluffs on the turn aren't going to work as well against them. But yeah, most of the money comes from betting good hands and then letting them give you a lot of money when you've got a good hand. And then the last one, which I think I touched on, but when you get to those river spots where they're likely to have air, make sure you're not betting big. You can bet small to try to induce bluffs, or you can check to try to induce bluffs, but look for those spots to induce bluffs on the river rather than going for kind of thin value. Generally speaking, obviously hand read, every situation is different. Use your poker abilities. Don't just blindly follow this strategy against anyone who loosely fits this description on every board texture. But yeah, that's how I would approach it. Generally, when you sit down at the table and somebody's clearly putting a lot of money into the pot, but you haven't figured out which kind of maniac they are, just play tight ranges and polarized ranges. So again, assume that you're going to get raised too frequently and bet hands that are comfortable getting raised, whether they're, bluffs that can just bet fold or very strong hands that want to get raised. And as you play with this player over time, pay attention to their showdowns, see if it seems like they're the over-bluffing type or if they're just ramming in too much money with pretty good hands, and then you can make the adjustments I talked about in the video. Hey everybody, Phil here. Today I want to talk about how to adjust to somebody who's not bluffing rivers enough. There are some obvious adjustments that you probably already are thinking of, but actually there are spots on not just the river, but on the turn and flop as well, where you can make adjustments. And also talk about one specific leak that I see in almost everybody that I talk to about poker with regards to check raise bluffing the river or bluff raising the river in general. So what's the most obvious adjustment when somebody's not bluffing river enough? It's if you're facing a river bet and you have a hand that should sometimes call and sometimes fold, or even a hand that should usually call or maybe always call, but only beats a bluff, you should fold. The way that poker works in theory is, your opponent's supposed to bluff a certain frequency based on the bet size and the pot size. And then you're supposed to defend a certain frequency based on that. However, if your opponent is bluffing 3% less often than they should, now all of a sudden the correct counter strategy, assuming they're not going to readjust, is to just fold everything, all of your bluff catchers, because now your opponent's not bluffing enough. Your calls are all going to be losing money on average. So that's the simple way to go about it. The only point that I really want to hammer home there is, don't feel obligated to call with hands that are supposed to be a call against somebody who's just bluffing half as much as they should. So let's get into some of the more interesting adjustments. So starting on the river, which is kind of closer to the obvious place to make adjustments, and then we're gonna backtrack to the turn as well. So I'm gonna give you just an example board. So let's say that we face a button open, we call in the big blind with king 4 of diamonds, and the flop is king 10-8 with 2 spades. Check, our opponent c-bets, we call. He c-bets small. Turn is a 4 offsuit, giving us 2 pair. We check, our opponent checks, and now river is a 10, pairing the 10 on the flop and counterfeiting our 2 pair. So this is normally a spot where you would want to check call because in addition to having a weak kicker with your king, and in addition to the 10 coming on the river, which could give your opponent trips, you also block the 4, which is a hand that could potentially call you. However, against an opponent who doesn't bluff enough, a lot of the value in checking this hand comes from, first of all, inducing bluffs. You check, your opponent bluffs, you call, and you block 2 pairs. So you block showdown value, you block hands that can value bet, and you block hands that would never bluff, but you unblock bluffs. But the second thing is, if you bet small on the river, or even bet larger on the river, you run the risk of facing a raise by a hand like a 10, which your opponent can rep very credibly. The thing is, when you're playing against somebody who doesn't bluff nearly enough, you don't really have to be worried about getting raised by a 10 because you can just fold. Now, if your opponent is bluffing almost enough, you should still fold to the raise, but you have to be a little more careful because let's say you bet small here. Maybe they're not bluff raising quite enough, but they're still going to bluff raise sometimes, and with hands that you had beat that you're then going to fold to. But if they're really under bluffing, and especially for raises, going ahead and betting is low risk. The other thing is if they're almost bluffing enough, now the check call is like kind of okay. They could value bet a chop, so you don't necessarily need to check fold. Then you'll induce some bluffs. But against a player who is just clearly not bluffing enough, both for the bet when check two and for a raise when facing a small bet, you should just always small bet this hand and try to get a little bit of value against ace queen, thinking you missed a draw, against pocket nines, whatever they may have that decided to c-bet the flop and check back turn. Just go for a little bit of value, and that's going to be the way to take advantage of them. Besides just folding when you have a bluff catcher. In addition to skipping those value check raises with hands like ace 10, you actually want to skip check raise bluffs. And this is something I could talk for a while about. It's something that a lot of people mess up. I want to get back to it a little bit later. But first I want to talk about turns and actually flop play as well. I think as you get further removed from the node in the game tree that we're talking about, where there's a leak, which is that your opponent is not bluffing river enough, the adjustments get less obvious. So I want to talk now about turn adjustments. We'll go with the example of Jack 10-6 with a flush draw, and then a 5 of clubs bringing 2 flush draws. So let's say we are in late position, early position raises, we call, and our opponent bets twice. They c-bet flop and they c-bet turn. Well, now against somebody who is playing a normal range, a hand like ace 10 is in, like ace 10 off is in pretty rough shape, because you lose to all their value bets, all their semi-bluffs are going to have reasonable equity, and the board is going to get scarier on the river pretty often, and you're going to end up folding the best hand sometimes. But against somebody who doesn't bluff enough, I should specify, doesn't bluff enough on river, hand like ace 10 goes up in value quite a bit. Of course, if they just don't even semi-bluff on the turn, well, now ace 10 is just a bad call, regardless of how they play the river, because they just have too much value. But if they semi-bluff hands that they should, they're betting some ace queen and some king queen and some flush draws. But once the river hits and they brick, they're just going to check fold. Now a hand like ace 10 goes up in value. Other hands that do very well against somebody who bluffs enough rivers are like big draws. So queen 9 of clubs on this board, where there's a club flush draw on the flop, let's say. Because in addition to being able to hit your draw and make money with the bet, you also might get bluffed into. Once you hit your draw, then you can raise or call, depending on which draw you hit and how scary the board got. Those hands go down in value a lot. Now, queen 9 of clubs, for example, on this board, I'm never folding anyways. But some other flush draws against a really big bet, you might shy away from continuing with. There's kind of a double-edged sword in that if they're not going to bluff, let's say on a brick river, now when you call turn with, I don't know, 7-8, they're going to sometimes check to you with hands that would have bluffed and now check fold. But they also might just be checking a lot of pairs to pick off a bluff when all those draws miss. So I wouldn't say those necessarily go up in value. In spots where you're normally going to be, like you have a dicey call on the turn with a made hand that is not going to improve very often, is going to be in an uncomfortable spot on a lot of rivers, against somebody who's not going to bluff rivers very often, you can now comfortably call those hands and then comfortably fold the river. But knowing that very often the river's going to go check, check, and you're going to win. The same is true in spots where you might want to value bet yourself. So let's say flop is, let's say that cutoff opens, you call in the big blind with ace 4 of diamonds, and the flop is ace queen 3, you check, they check back. And let's say now the turn is a 9, bringing a flush draw. So ace queen 3, 9. Rainbow flop, turn brings a flush draw. This is a pretty good check call hand normally. And part of the reason is that when you bet and the river changes the board, now your value bet's kind of thin. You could potentially get bluff raised. Also, if you check river, you're going to be in a dicey spot where they can go for value with anything better than your hand. And especially if some draws complete, again, you get in dicey spots. But against somebody who's not going to bluff river, just go ahead and take your value on the turn, bet the turn. And then if the river is really safe, you can go for a small value bet. If the river is really not safe, if it's a really scary river, just check. They're not going to turn their bottom pair into a bluff on a scary river, or they're not going to turn whatever their king high plus gut shot that missed into a bluff on a scary river, because they just don't bluff enough. So now actually, in addition to being able to fold the river The fact that you can comfortably fold that river and that you're not going to face the bet as often means that you can now value bet the turn with hands that otherwise couldn't. And then if you want to step back all the way to the flop, it's actually kind of the same adjustments you would make on the turn. So sometimes, let's say late position opens, you call in the big blind with king 10, and the flop is 10-9-4 with two spades. And you're relatively deep. So this is a hand that, maybe you could check raise, maybe you could check call. Against somebody who's not going to bluff rivers often enough. Like, part of the reason you don't check raise this hand is because you're inflating the pot, and then the turn and the river are often going to be scary for your actual hand, and you're going to be put in some difficult spots. But if you're up against somebody who's not going to put you in those difficult spots, now you can go for that value raise right away on the flop with king 10. And, if the turn's a jack of spades, just check. And, maybe you check call, maybe you check fold, depending on how much they bet. But just know that you're going to safely be able to check fold river. You're not going to face as many river bluffs. And therefore, you can go for more value now without fearing the consequences and repercussions of the board getting dicier for you. So now that we've covered flops and turns, as well as most of river play, I want to talk a little bit more about bluff raising river against people who don't bluff enough, because I think it's something that everybody messes up for the most part, not just in the way that they play, but conceptually. So on that same board, you might normally check raise a hand like ace 10 or 10-8 or 4, what have you, against an opponent who's not bluffing nearly enough. Well, now they didn't bet the turn, so they don't have a lot of, ace king, king queen. When you check river, they're not going to have a lot of value bets when you block the 10 especially, and they're not going to bluff. So you're not inducing a lot of river bets. You're much better off just going for value yourself. So you actually, against somebody who doesn't bluff that much, when you're out of position, you just don't go for many check raises for value. And you also don't go for many check raises as a bluff. This is a concept that I think a lot of people really struggle with. And it's when you're making a check raise bluff on the river, yes, you are targeting their value bets, their thinner value bets. You're trying to make their value bets fold. However, if, let's say, you check and you're facing a pot size bet, they're supposed to be bluffing 1/3 of the time. And then when you check raise to whatever amount, let's say you're risking, like you're laying yourself 1-1, which is a small check raise, but let's just say you are. They need to fold half the time and call half the time, which actually means they're going to fold all 33% of their bluffs. So they only need to fold another 17% of hands of their 67% value bets. So now they actually have to call most of their value bets when you're making a small raise there. Now, in that same scenario, if they have 10% bluffs instead of 33, well, now they fold those 10% bluffs, and now they have to fold 40 out of their 90% value bets. They have to fold a lot more of their value bets. So actually, going for check raise bluffs against people who are way under bluffing can often be very expensive, because part of the value and part of the expected value of check raise bluffing is that you're getting bluffs to fold as well as their value hands to fold. So keep that in mind. I think some people make the opposite adjustment and they think, well, I'd normally call with this hand, but this guy's never bluffing, so I can't call, but maybe I can check raise and make him fold a pair. The people that you can't call against are also people that you shouldn't be bluff raising very often, unless, of course, they have another character trait, which is that they way overfold to raises, right? So on that same board, skip the check raises with 10x and skip the check raise bluffs. So you just end up against somebody who's not bluffing that much. You end up doing a lot of the betting yourself because they're not doing the betting for you. So to sum up, you can make some pretty obvious river decisions. I'm sure you know what to do there. And not just with facing bets, but in anticipation of facing bets, you can plan differently. But that plan doesn't need to start on the river. It can start on the turn, or it can even start on the flop. And you can start playing value hands more aggressively, knowing that you're not going to get blown off of them if the board gets scary. Hopefully this was helpful for you. Good luck at the tables against all those under-bluffers. Hey everybody, Phil here. Today, I want to talk about pre-flop adjustments. In past adjustment videos, I've talked about a single post-flop leak and gone into how to take advantage of that on multiple streets. With pre-flop, some of the adjustments are super simple. So I kind of wanted to batch them all together. We're not going to cover, every possible pre-flop leak and how to adjust to it, but we'll just talk about pre-flop in general and how to make adjustments. Let's start with a super obvious one. Let's say it's folded to you in the small blind and you're up against a big blind who folds too much against a raise. That's an easy one. You just start raising everything. If they're folding enough to make raising with any two cards profitable, you raise with any two cards. Take yourself back, one position to the button, and now let's say the big blind folds too much, but the small blind doesn't. Now, it the actual math on, basically like how much they fold, and where the cutoff becomes then for you to add additional hands to your opening range is not, that's for you to figure out. But you definitely can add some hands if the big blind folds too much. And even if the small blind folds too much, you can add a couple more hands, although most of the defense comes from the big blind. So focus on the big blind's kind of leaks or tendencies. You can also open more hands if the big blind and the small blind don't 3-bet enough. This is a common one that you'll see in live poker. They're just not finding the 3-bet bluffs. And so their 3-bet percentage, instead of being 10% in that spot, or actually small blinds could be as high as 20, I don't know. But let's say instead of being 12%, which is supposed to be, it's like 4% or 5%, you get to open more hands because of that. If they play poorly post-flop, you get to play more hands because you're going to get unexpected, like EV that the pre-flop charts don't take into account post-flop because they're going to make mistakes. Now, if let's take the opposite case. Let's say the blinds are too loose. You might say, oh, well, they're too loose, so I should be able to take advantage. Like some of my hands should do better because they're playing, too wide of a range. No, some of the EV from your weakest opens, in theory, come from stealing the blinds. Like a lot of it comes from stealing the blinds and getting some hands that dominate you to fold. Like when you're raising whatever it is, 7-5 suited, you're making a lot of 7-8 offsuits fold, things like that. If they're playing too loose, you have to open tighter and you're going to get more value with your good hands. A lot of people think, oh, well, if somebody's making a mistake, the way I take advantage is, if they're making a mistake, I must be able to play more hands to take advantage of that mistake. But sometimes the mistake, the way you take advantage is you play fewer hands because those hands lose value. The value all goes to to your better hands that you're going to keep opening. That's where their mistake benefits you. Similarly, if they're 3-betting too often, you can't open as many hands because you get denied equity. Like a lot of the hands that have to fold to the 3-bet get denied equity more often, lose some of that EV post-flop. And then it's pretty important I think this is the one people struggle with the most, is when you face a tight opener, so somebody's raised with a range that's too tight, you have to fold some hands that are calls in theory. Now, the types of hands you want to fold, obviously, it depends on stack size and positions and a whole bunch of other things. But generally, against a tighter range, implied odds hands like 5-5 or 7-8 suited go up in value, whereas high card hands like king-queen offsuit, ace-jack offsuit, ace-queen offsuit go down in value because those are dominated more often and are less frequently going to flop a huge hand that stacks their overpair, for example. There are a lot more obvious ones as we continue. So if they're folding to 3-bets too much, you have to 3-bet bluff more. And you probably still want to 3-bet your value hands, but that can become more complicated if it's, all right, so somebody opens an early position and they just always fold to the 3-bet unless they have, queens plus, and you're next to act with aces. Depending on the makeup of the table, you probably call and slow play more often because somebody behind you is going to do something, but the table conditions might not be, they might not be such that makes sense. You have to take into account a lot of different things because also something that could happen is they could raise, you could 3-bet and somebody could cold 4-bet with queens that you get more value from then. The pre-flop adjustment that people love to make is to play more hands, and they love to justify it by, well, my opponent's folding too much or they're really bad post-flop. So, this really weak player opens and now I'm just going to call with a bunch of terrible hands. Those justifications, the logic is good, sort of, but you have to be very careful about how far you take the adjustment. So a couple of things to keep in mind. Bad hands in good situations, and by good situations, I mean you're up against a really weak player, you're up against somebody who's folding to 3-bets too often or folding their big blind too often, etc. Like when you have a good excuse to play a bad hand, those excuses work in scenarios where not many people are going to be entering the pot. So if a really terrible player opens with a normal range for middle position and it's folded to me in the big blind, if they're bad enough, I'll just play any hand because they're just going to make such big mistakes that even, 7-deuce offsuit is going to flop enough stuff enough of the time that to capitalize on their huge mistakes. But, if they're terrible, and they raise and 3 other people call, unless the way that they're terrible is that they just go all in blind on every flop, or so like they just put in a ton of money, then sure, call and see if you flop trip sevens or seven, like 2 pairs, sevens and deuces, and then they're going to put their whole stack in. But most people, I mean, I haven't seen quite that that leak specifically in my career. But basically, anytime you want to take advantage of something, and there's an opportunity for a lot of other people to enter the pot, temper your adjustments. And so, yeah, if the big blind folds too much, but there are 5 people between us and the big blind, we can't we can open maybe 1 or 2 hands that we couldn't otherwise. But you can't go much further than that because all these other people are going to play against you too. And if somebody who their leak is that post flop they're just super weak tight, if they miss the flop they check fold. Well, now if they open in the cutoff and it's folded to me in the big blind, I can play most hands because I'm just going to steal the pot later. But if they open in early position and 2 other players call, I like being able to bluff one of the 3 of them out of the pot more easily is not really helping my weak hands. I just want to give you this general rule of, as you're making these pre-flop adjustments, don't overdo it in spots where more people can enter the pot than the one that you're targeting. Hopefully you found that helpful. And hopefully, I mean, basically all of us take our pre-flop adjustments too far when we because we like to play more hands. It's more fun. So err on the side of not taking them too far. But if you want to take them too far, do it when it's a heads up pot. Good luck out there. Hey everybody, Phil here. I got a couple of questions about adjusting to specific opponent types. And I want to talk to you about kind of a general adjustment concept that I think is super, super important. And from there, I want to talk about building reads. The most common question I've gotten throughout these adjustment videos is, Phil, how do you go about building reads? So at the end of this video, I'll walk you through that as well. So I recently did a video on how to adjust to somebody who is under-bluffing, specifically under-bluffing rivers. And I talked about the many ways in which you take advantage of that, not just on the river. I recommend you check it out if you're interested in that kind of thing. I got a few questions and a couple, specifically asking, can you exploit an under-bluffer through aggression, or is that futile? And another question asking, how do you adjust to somebody who's not value betting thinly enough? And actually, these 2 specific questions, they were longer questions. They kind of go a long way out of where I'm going to talk about today. But they brought up an important concept. They made me think of an important concept that I really want to talk about. So when somebody is making a mistake, whether it be not value betting thinly enough, not bluffing enough, that does something to the range that they're betting, the range that they're being aggressive with, but it also does something to the range that they're not betting. It has to. A lot of people think, oh, well, this player, is super passive and they're just not bluffing enough, but I, can't bluff them very well because they call a lot, or because they're so passive, maybe they're trapping a little bit more. But here's the thing. If, let's say, you raise button and the big blind calls, flop is whatever. They check, you check. Turn is whatever. They check. So let's say that in this spot, this is called a turn probe opportunity. A probe bet is when your opponent had the impetus on the previous street, they check back. Now you're first to act. You have the opportunity to bet. So this is a probe opportunity, turn probe opportunity. Let's say that they miss basically all their bluffs in this spot that a solver would bet. So what do you know? You know that their probing range is way too strong. So when they do probe, you're going to fold a lot. But you have to keep in mind that all of these hands that were supposed to bluff in this turn probing range, those hands had to go somewhere. They're now in the turn checking range. And so now when they check, even if they check all of the hands they're supposed to check, they've also checked these extra ones that they're not supposed to check, that they're supposed to bluff with. And because they're bluffs, they're weak. And so now instead of having, let's say, a balanced 60% of their hands range, they have 75% of hands, and that extra 15 is weak. So their range as a whole has been weakened. And so now, even if they defend perfectly according to which hands are supposed to check call and check raise, like in a solver, they have those pesky 15% of extra weak hands that they just are going to have to fold because they're too weak for the most part. Now, obviously, some of those are potential semi-bluffs on the turn, and they can check call or they can check raise, whatever. But essentially, anytime somebody doesn't put hands in a certain range, they end up in the other range, and that range becomes potentially attackable, more attackable, or less attackable. Same thing happens on the river. And so on the river, it's a little bit more clear. Let's say they check call flop, turn goes check, check, and now they check the river. So here, let's say they're not bluffing enough. Now, when they bet, you should fold because their range is too strong. But also when they check, in addition to those, let's use the same numbers. So 60% of hands that were supposed to check, and they're supposed to call a pot size bet with 30% of them, which is half. Now they've checked 75, and they only have 30% calling hands, but they have 45% folding hands. So they're actually going to overfold this spot because they've just put weak hands in that range that are not supposed to be there. And the same thing happens with people who don't value bet enough. So let's go back to the turn probe opportunity. Let's say somebody's just like, let's just use the opposite example to illustrate a point, which is, somebody on the turn in a probe opportunity is betting all of their potential semi-bluffs. So they have an open-ender, they have a gut shot, they have a flush draw, they love to bet. They have like a future flush draw blocker and an overcard, they love to bet. So they find all the bluffs and maybe even too many bluffs. But when they have whatever it may be, mid pair, good kicker, or weak top pair that's supposed to go for 2 streets of value, they don't like to. It makes them uncomfortable. So they check those hands. Well, now they have a checking range that's too strong because, so their betting range is too weak, and you know what to do against that. You call a lot and raise a lot. And then once you call down, assuming they bluff river appropriately with their now weakened range. But they also now have added some potential value bets, or would-be value bets, should-be value bets, to their checking range. So their checking range now, instead of being 60% that's well-balanced, it's 60% with that extra 15% pretty good hands. And so now you don't want to attack that range. You want to under-bluff against that range. You don't want to, you might not want to go quite as thinly for value, but most of the value hands can still value bet. But they're going to call more often because they have those hands left over in their checking range. So the point I wanted to illustrate is, whatever the adjustment we're talking about, whatever the leak is, because I can make YouTube videos for the next 10 years, and we won't cover every specific spot that could ever come up in the game of poker. I want you to be able to think through, all right, well, I know this about my opponent, and I know what to do against that. I know how to adjust to that. But what does that mean about their other ranges? And how do I adjust to that? It's a super important part of adjusting to specific opponents. And I play a lot of heads-up poker, so it's always front of mind for me. What is wrong about their range in the most obvious spot? And then those hands that are missing from that range, or those hands that are added from that range, they're either added or removed from a different range, and you get to attack that too. And you don't necessarily attack it on that specific street. It could be on a later street, like you've seen me talk about in previous adjustment videos. The adjustments are not always super obvious and straightforward, but basically every range mistake that you make has a domino effect, and it impacts all the other ranges you have, and that compounds street by street. And so even the best players in the world, by the time they get to the river, their range is out of whack. And if you can figure out in which specific way it's out of whack, that's how you figure out how to beat them. So I hope that was helpful. Thank you all for the questions. I know I actually didn't answer any specific questions that the commenters meant to ask, but made me think of a great concept. So one question that I've been getting a lot that I can actually answer is, how do you go about developing reads? This is a very common question, and I didn't want to make a full video on it because it's actually, there's not a lot to it, or there is a lot to it, but there's not a lot to explain in video format. So essentially, the main thing I want to emphasize is that you should really focus on hands that are shown down. I'm talking about live poker here, by the way, but when you're playing, and it's very common that you will feel like somebody's playing really aggressively, or you will feel like somebody's folding a lot. You really, I hate to say it because like you're trying to process information all the time, but you really can't trust yourself and those feelings about things that are statistical. Now, if you're actually tracking how often they're betting the turn and you're tracking how often they're folding the river, that's a different story. You can have some real data, but it also doesn't tell you the whole story. So I've sometimes played against people who seem really aggressive, and I'm like, okay, well, this person's feels like they're pushing me out of every pot, and so I'm gonna make a stand. I'm gonna call them down, and then what it turns out is the case is they're just like never slow playing, and they're going way too thinly for value, and so they're still like they're really aggressive with a pretty strong range because they're just missing some bluffs and they're adding too many value, and now this person that I feel like's been running me over. They've been running me over with top pair. And making me fold second pair. And now I call them down with third pair and I lose. So that's one of the reasons you can't really trust non-showdown aggression or passive play or folding. And the other reason is just that you're first of all, like we're terrible at estimating things like that. Our memories are, like there's emotion involved. And so you're going to remember more of the times when you're pushed out of a pot. You're going to remember more of the times that your hero called on the river because those are more painful moments or frustrating moments. A lot of times when, whatever, you bet flop with top pair and you bet again on the turn and they fold, just like that's over. You don't think about it. And also just the sample sizes, especially if you're playing live poker, they're just too small. Like if over the course of 1 week, you're playing at a 9-handed table with the same 8 people, how many times are you going to see one player have the opportunity to fold to a river bet? It's not very often. And, let's say that they fold on average 50% of the time and you've seen, I'm totally guessing, but let's say you've seen 25 opportunities for them to fold. It's really easy for them to have folded 18 of 25 just because they've been unlucky in their hand distribution over those 25 hands. Just not a lot of data. So really focus on showdowns because it only takes one showdown where you see somebody like value bet a hand that has no business value betting, or you see them bluff with like a pretty crazy hand, or you see them not bluff with the bottom of their range. That tells you so much about the way that they play. So much faster than seeing, 100 hands play out where you don't get to see their cards. So the only point I wanted to make is pay attention to showdowns, and pay attention to showdowns.
So Phil, speaking for yourself, when you're gathering data, looking to make adjustments, is that a gut reaction? You're just slowly getting a feeling, I think he's doing this, or is it much more conscious and front of mind where you're saying, okay, he's done something like that 8 times. I think that means that it's 60%, likely that he's making this type of mistake. So the adjustment I make would be this.
Yeah. So let me give an answer that's potentially usable. So in finding these reads on your opponent, I'd love to talk about how to go about developing them and how I go about finding them. The issue is there are 2 very separate answers to that. And one of them is if you're playing online on a site that has hand histories, you have access to a lot of data. And if you're playing against the same opponent for long enough, you have a lot of data on that opponent. And so data and statistics become a huge part of figuring that out. And so it's not only, let me skip back. If you don't have that, either because you're playing live or because you're playing on a site that doesn't provide hand histories, or because you're just playing against somebody, you play 200 hands against them, it's not enough to have any reliable statistics, then it's all about showdowns. It's all about looking at showdowns. And in that case, what I do is I do watch a hand play out. And basically, if I see at showdown a spot where like they check with a very good bluffing hand, or they bluff with like a really bad bluffing hand, no relevant blockers, and then I start to think, okay, well maybe they under-bluff or maybe they over-bluff, and I keep an eye out for it. Supporting evidence that they over-bluff is not always obvious. So let's say you think somebody over-bluffs. Part of the supporting evidence you can get for that is that when they check, they don't show like potential bluffing hands. They always show, oh, I have second pair. Oh, I have third pair. Oh, I have top pair. And so that can support the evidence that, well, you've seen them bet a couple hands that you don't think should bet. you haven't seen them check a hand that you think should bluff. And those things add up over time. And then you can also, like, less reliable data is, when they check, it doesn't seem like they're check folding a lot, because maybe all of the hands that would have to check fold have bluffed, for example. That's that way. And then if you have access to statistics, it's much different, because in addition to the showdowns, you can see, oh, well, their fold percentage is too high in this spot. From there, you do have to kind of investigate, okay, why is it too high? Because there could be a lot of explanations. First of all, it could be, they fold hands that they shouldn't. But second of all, it could be they get there with too many weak hands, either because they didn't bluff them earlier or because they've value bet too many hands earlier that should either slow play or just pot control, whatever the case may be. And so you go on a mission kind of to find, okay, well, I see that this stat is off by a lot. And it's enough of a sample that I think it's legit. So level one is you could just be like, all right, I'm just going to bluff here a lot. And that will work. But to find the best counter adjustment, you have to kind of find the root cause. And it's like, okay, so they're folding a lot here. Why? Is it, like I said, because they just fold hands that should not fold, or they've gotten there with a messed up range? And usually when you investigate, you'll find that they did get there with a messed up range, and actually elsewhere, they have messed up ranges too, and you actually find new things to take advantage of. And so that's why I like to investigate further. Hey everybody, Phil here. So today I want to talk about how to adjust to a player who continuation bets the flop too frequently. This is a pretty common leak that people make. They bet too often after raising pre-flop. I want to talk about it because it's very nuanced, and the way that you take advantage is not always clear. And there's no kind of general adjustment to somebody who's c-betting too often. I mean, the general adjustment is that when you're kind of defending against their raises, weak hands go down in value, strong hands go up in value because you're facing more flop aggression. But are they c-betting too many good hands? Are they c-betting too many bluffs? Are they just c-betting too many of both? Because the correct adjustment to each of those is different. Usually, I think what you see is, somebody in a spot where they're supposed to have like a 60% c-bet frequency, they just c-bet like 90%. But actually, the strength of their c-betting range is not that different. It's a little bit weaker because you only can make so many sets in two pair, and those are all already betting. But the way that you're supposed to play in theory with the 60% c-bet is that, some of your pretty good hands you check back to protect that check back range. And then you also check back some draws, and you check back some total air as well. And you might be a little bit more likely to bet good hands and to check bad hands, but you don't just bet all your good hands and check all your bad hands, because that leaves your check back range way too weak and exploitable. When somebody's betting 90% instead of 60%, they often, only slightly weaken their range. And so the way that you respond to their c-bet and the way that you respond to their check back, it might not need to change that much. And I think that's not intuitive to people, because they're thinking, well, this person's betting, 1.5 times as often as they're supposed to. So I have to attack this. I have to fight back. Not necessarily. Now I'm speaking in generalities. It's going to depend on the spot. But again, that range that they're betting with is maybe slightly weakened. So maybe you call with a few more hands than you would have. Maybe you raise with a few more hands than you would have. But don't go crazy adjusting just because you see that frequency get too high. The range composition might not be that different. Now, let's say instead we have somebody who's c-betting too often because they're c-betting all the hands that should, but then also every bluff, because they're just going to take their one stab at the pot and then give up. But then they do still check, when they have middle pair, they'll check back sometimes. And when they have top pair, weak kicker, they'll check back sometimes. When they have an under pair, they'll check back sometimes. But when they have air, they just always bet because they want to win the pot. Now that's something you have to adjust more strongly to, because now that c-betting range is far too weak. Their check back range is actually getting too strong as well. So what you'll see there in terms of adjustments is, against their continuation bet, you need to call more often, you need to bluff raise more often. You need to value raise more often too, but especially bluff raise more often. Now, I'm not gonna make this a 50-minute video, but for value raising more often, like it depends what they do. It depends if they bet too many bluffs and they realize their range is wide, so they defend more than they should, or like they defend an appropriate amount of their widened range. Well, now value raises go up in value. But if they don't, if they just defend kind of normal hands that they defend, so they're overfolding, now your bluffs go up in value. Your value raises actually stay kind of the same in EV as a check raise, but you have to keep in mind they might gain more value as calls because your opponent now has more potential bluffs on the turn and river when you check call. So the answer to all this is always, it depends. But I just wanted to give you some tools for things to think about. Oh, and the other adjustment there is, so if they put all their bluffs in their c-betting range, now if they check back, when they check back, they have, weak top pair, middle pair, under pair. You can still try to, value bet and bluff against that range, but you probably want to bluff a little bit less. The biggest adjustment and that where you'll make the most money is actually folding if they bet later in the hand, because they just don't have any bluffs left. So you can actually massively overfold to somebody who's c-betting all their air once they check back and bet any later street. That's going to be very important to adjusting them. So then let's take the other example. Somebody's c-betting too much because they're just betting every pair, but they're not adding an appropriate number of bluffs. So they're going to have the opposite problem. Their c-betting range is going to get too value heavy. So you should actually fold some of the hands on the margin. On the margins, you should raise fewer bluffs for sure. Like really you should just drop all your bluff raises unless you think they're going to notice. You can still value raise just as much, or actually you can value raise more thinly because now they have more second pair, more weak top pair, things that they can call raises with. But then what's super important against them is when they check back, they have too much air. So you get to bluff turn a lot. You get to check call turn. If they start betting later, they have too many bluffs to choose from. So that's the way you take advantage of that. So really, an opponent who c-bets too much could mean a lot of different things, as hopefully I've illustrated here. And it's important to dig deeper than that, but there are adjustments you can make. Now, there's a more complicated way to take advantage of somebody who c-bets too much is actually to drop some of your pre-flop 3-bets against them. So they raise cutoff, you're in the big blind, and you have a hand that you normally 3-bet. Like in theory, part of the reason those hands 3-bet is that they want to get more money into the pot than they would when they just call. But actually, this opponent is letting you get more money into the pot on the flop if you want to, when you just call than they should. So calling those gets higher in value. And then you can see if you like the flop and you can check raise the flop if you want to. So that's kind of a more subtle or kind of odd adjustment that you can make. And you can make that against anybody, regardless of how they're constructing that too often flop c-bet range, because they're just putting more volume of money into the pot once you call. And that's what you want with your good hands. Hopefully you found that helpful. It, like I said, there's no one size fits all adjustment. But hopefully the way that I talked through each of these examples gives you an idea of how to think through and adjust to, whatever range construction mistake that you think your opponent's making. I hope you found that helpful, and I'll see you in the next video. I hope you found all those adjustments helpful. And if there are specific player types that you have in mind, maybe you play against them regularly, that you would like to know how I would adjust to them, please let me know in the comments below. I can either answer you there or potentially create another video about adjustments that might spark an idea for me. So I appreciate your time, and hope it was helpful for you. And I will see you in the comment section and the next video. Until then, take care, everybody.